Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Valainis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Montana Renewable Energy Association. Before we begin, I would like to recognize our sponsors, Clearwater Credit Union, Kaufman Engineers, the Montana Energy Office, On-Site Energy, the Alternative Energy Resources Organization, or AERO, and Ford Montana Foundation. Today we're going to be talking about the Montana Public Service Commission and what it is and how it works. Really quickly, a little bit about MREA and what we do. We are a statewide advocacy group and an education group based here. I'm based in Missoula, Montana, and we do all sorts of education and advocacy programs all across the state, including working with the Montana legislature and with the Montana Public Service Commission, which is exactly what we're talking about today. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right in. First, I want to start with a little bit about kind of why we have regulation, because I think this is an important topic to kind of lay the foundation of the discussion for today. So first and foremost, there are certain utilities, so energy, but also water, and electricity and natural gas, things like that, that are considered essential services. And within some of those industries, competition may actually be a detriment to customers. So if you think back, 100 years ago or more, when we were building the railroads, for example, imagine if multiple railroad companies, for example, had to lay down all of their own track in order to provide service to customers. There'd be dozens of railroad lines running through communities, and it'd be really challenging. Obviously, it'd be unsightly, and it'd be really expensive. And so there are certain cases where competition in a market may actually increase prices for consumers, which would be a bad thing. So in certain cases, there are businesses that are given what are called natural monopolies. And so they are allowed to be the only business serving certain customer bases. What that creates is captive customers that don't have choice, right? So in Montana, for example, your energy provider is dictated by where you live. You don't have a choice to choose who you get your energy from. And if you think about that from a normal business perspective, what would you do with a lack of competition? Well, you would take the money and run, right? You would charge, $1,000 per kilowatt hour, for example, and people wouldn't be able to afford energy, and it'd be a terrible situation. So instead, what we have is regulation. And regulation and what's called the regulatory compact is this balance between allowing a single entity, a single business, to have a captive customer base and to provide energy for all of those customers. And in return, they are regulated. They agree to adhere to rules and policies set by the government and the state. So the role of regulation is to provide them or ensure the provision of safe, adequate, and reliable service, right? If they didn't have oversight, businesses could charge as much as they want and do a poor job of doing it because there's no motivation otherwise. Regulation is also responsible for ensuring prices are sufficient, but not more so. And what that means is you don't want to be overcharging customers, and you also don't want to be preventing utility, which is a for-profit business, to cover its costs, right, including its return on investment. As for-profit businesses, although there are energy providers in the state that are nonprofits like our cooperatives, but our for-profit businesses, they are allowed to make a return on investment, and that's an okay thing because we want our utilities to be healthy companies that make money. That's how they attract investors, which is how they can have enough capital for supply resource investments and maintain infrastructure and things like that. So we want a healthy and well-operating utility, but there's a balance there, and that's the real role of the Public Service Commission. And their role is a balance between the art and the science of a number of different kind of functions that we'll talk about in a little bit. But first and foremost, let's talk about their structure. So the Montana Public Service Commission is part of our legislative branch. And the important difference is that the state legislature is the entity that's responsible primarily for creating policy, right? They're the ones every legislative session, they create laws and vote those laws, and those laws kind of govern the land. The Public Service Commission is an entity that enacts policy. They don't create policy, they enact it. Now, sometimes they create rules, and we'll talk about that later today. And those rules help clarify processes by which they are enacting policy. But again, they are not changing statutes, and they're not creating statutes. They're implementing them. So we have 5 commissioners in Montana. They serve 4-year staggered terms, and they can serve a maximum of 2 consecutive terms. You can't serve more than 8 years in any 16-year period. They are elected, and they are partisan positions, and they don't require any specific background experience in order to become a commissioner. Now, this is not necessarily a novel approach. There are a lot of states that have elected commissions that don't require certain background experience. That's supposed to be, the vetting process for that experience is supposed to be the election itself. There are states out there, a number of states, who have appointed commissions, and in that case, typically the commissions require, they're in statute or in the rules, it will have some kind of required background experience, either in regulation, policy, or law, or economics, or engineering, or something like that. But in Montana, that is not the case. I also want to mention that the PSC is not just the 5 commissioners. They have a number of support staff, lawyers, economists, engineers, and other types of analysts. They have administrative staff that just helps around the agency. And these folks are really, really important. They do a lot of research and support to help the commissioners really take a deep dive into understanding the issues, and understanding kind of the details, and informing the commissioners to help them make their decision. I will say in particular, I think the Montana Public Service Commission has an excellent support staff, really, really intelligent people who work there, and do really good work. So I think we're very fortunate in that regard. The PSC districts are broken up by county. You can see the 5 of them there. What this means is if you know your county, you can figure out who your commissioner is just by looking it up on the website. So we do have 5 of them. Like I said, they're elected, and they represent kind of different parts of the state. So let's talk a little bit now. This is really what I want to focus on today, is the PSC and 3 particular functions that they have that really affect renewable energy development in Montana. And the first thing we're going to talk about is long-term supply resource planning. And that mouthful really just means they look at the resources that utilities want to purchase in order to generate and provide energy. So think of a large-scale wind farm, a large-scale solar farm, a natural gas plant, a coal-fired plant like Colstrip, of course. That planning process is something that the PSC oversees. And what the utility will do is look at, that phrase long-term. They typically look at about 20 years out and look at resources that they think they're going to need based on energy forecasts for their customers. So, how much energy are we going to need to provide each year? How are we going to provide that energy? It is a non-committal document, meaning that this is not necessarily exactly what the utility is going to do over the next 20 years, but it's their plan, it's their best guess and best idea of what they're going to do. And they've certainly, I know utilities in the state have certainly brought that up as an important point, that it's not prescriptive, right? It doesn't necessarily say, here's exactly what we're going to do. However, it's a very influential document, because if you make a plan like this and you get positive responses from stakeholders and the PSC, and you do all this research and all this work to show you what you're going to need, it's something you can certainly use as a very influential tool, and look back to it and point back to it as a way to help you make certain decisions in the future. So it's certainly influential. The PSC's role in all of this is they oversee this process, they make comments on it, but importantly, they don't approve or reject the plan. So again, this is not a prescription, right? The utility isn't saying this is exactly what we're going to do, and for that reason, the PSC doesn't approve or reject it. But the PSC does make comments, and these comments are important because it signals to the utility the elements of the plan that they find the utility did well. They talk about its shortcomings, places where they didn't provide enough analysis. They may make comments on other things that they may include in the future that maybe they left out or just didn't think to put in, things like that. What I will mention is that, again, talking about approving and rejecting the plan from the PSC perspective, pre-approval is separate from this resource planning process. And I'll explain what pre-approval is. First of all, let's talk about rate basing. What rate basing means is that if a utility goes out and makes certain purchases, they are allowed to recover the costs of those purchases using utility rates that customers pay, along with a small reasonable profit, which we talked about, right? There's this rate of return that they're allowed to earn as a for-profit company. Rate basing is great for utilities because it essentially allows them to pay off these assets, right? And we as customers are charged, however many cents per kilowatt hour over a certain number of years to help pay for those costs. That's very typical practice in utility rate making. What a pre-approval does is it allows the utility to ensure that they will be able to rate base a certain purchase before they make that purchase. Something I want to make really clear, which I think is really important, is at any given time, a utility can make a purchase if they want to. So they could, purchase a wind farm or a coal strip or whatever it is. They could make that purchase if they want to at any given time, but they're not necessarily guaranteed to be able to recover those costs and rates. So they're taking on that risk by making that purchase because they may just have to front the cost and not be able to do it or pay off that cost through rates. What pre-approval does is it allows the utility to essentially be guaranteed that they will be able to recover those costs before they make that purchase. And that's obviously a big discussion right now with coal strip and everything going on, which I'm not going to get too deep into, but that is kind of part of that discussion, is this pre-approval process and how does that work. The next thing I want to talk about is contract terms for qualifying facilities, or QFs. In 1978, the federal government passed what's called the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, better known as PURPA. And the idea behind this law was it happened during the kind of oil and gas crisis back in the 70s. And the idea was to use this law to help stimulate kind of local and American-based energy development, and specifically renewable energy development. So it directed states to create special classes of generating facilities which had different kind of criteria that they had to meet in order to qualify for this program. And that criteria included a size restriction, so they had to be less than 80 megawatts. And it also included restrictions on the type of energy that was being provided. So wind, solar, I think certain geothermal, I think hydro is in there as well. So there's different type of criteria you had to meet. But if you were an energy developer and you did meet these criteria, you could apply to provide that energy to the utility in the area, and they had to purchase that energy. That was a clinching part of this law, is that the utilities must purchase that energy. Typically, the way that works is the developer and the utility are set to negotiate the terms of their energy purchase contract. So typically the length of the contract, number one, and number two, the price of the energy that the utility will pay. Those are the two big kind of sticking points. If the utility and the developer can't come to agreement, then they can go to the Public Service Commission in whatever state that they're in, and the PSC will act as the mediator and determine those contract terms. Now, this last bullet point I have on the slide, the standard offer for facilities smaller than 3 megawatts. This is a special part of this program where instead of negotiating contract terms, the PSC will periodically set specific terms, so a number of years and a price per megawatt hour or per kilowatt hour, that the developer can kind of take and use without negotiating. So for these smaller projects, instead of entering into negotiations with the utility, if they think the contract terms are worth it and they can use those terms to finance their project, then they can just say, we're fine with these. We don't necessarily want to negotiate. We'll just move forward with these and go from there. So again, PSC has a really important role here, both as the mediator and as the ones who periodically set those terms for the standard offer contract. And QFs are important in Montana because a lot of wind and solar development in Montana has been done through QF projects. Large-scale wind in the state, all 6 of the large-scale solar farms that we have in the state were all QFs, and there are a lot more QFs being continued to be developed today. The last one I want to talk about is creating customer classes and setting rates. So customers can use the grid differently, right? Think of like a large industrial business, like a manufacturer or something like that, who's running their operations, some of them, 24 hours a day and using a lot of energy, versus something like a residence, right? Where you leave in the morning to go to work. A lot of us are telecommuting these days, obviously, but typically you would leave in the morning, go to work, come home in the evening, and use some energy overnight. And for that reason, customers are grouped into different classes and charged differently because they use the grid differently. Now, the PSC is responsible for creating those customers classes and setting those rates. And what they will set is things like monthly charges. So if you look at your energy bill, there's a fixed amount that you pay every month that has nothing to do with how much energy you consume, right? It's just a fixed amount. That's your kind of monthly base rate or base charge. Then there's your volumetric rates or your energy rates. That's what you pay per kilowatt hour for electricity or per therm for your natural gas or whatever it is. So that's based on usage. And then there are other charges as well, things like demand charges. And the three that I described are your most basic rate structure. There are a whole different, there's myriad types of rate structures out there. And we won't get into those today, but the PSC is the one who sets those and not only decides what kind of rate structure there is, but what the actual dollars and cents are. This process normally happens through a rate review or a rate case is what it's called. I'm sure most of you will remember we went through one of these very recently with Northwestern Energy that just finished up last Thanksgiving. That was about a 15 to 18 month effort. So they take a long time, and normally what happens is it's done through that rate review. They use what are called cost of service studies, and it's a way for the utility to look at all the different costs that they need to cover, and then how to allocate those different costs to different customer classes. And folks intervene, and there are long discussions about them, but the PSC is where all of those discussions happen. So they clearly have a very big role in doing so. And in that particular rate review with Northwestern Energy, net metering customers were up for discussion, which is obviously hugely important to renewable energy development in the state. So it's an important function that they create or execute, I should say. One of the things I want to talk about quickly is just public engagement with the PSC. As a consumer, you obviously have access to the Public Service Commission. They're a state agency. You can always submit public comment on any issue that they're discussing. At their regular work meetings, you can always attend and provide public comment on issues. You can submit comment directly on dockets that they're working on or just general issues that you're concerned about. But the way the PSC typically does its work is through dockets, which is just the word they use to describe different projects that they're working on. And there are two real processes that they use. The first is a rulemaking, which is most similar to a legislative bill hearing process for those that are familiar with that. So the PSC will come up with a rule that's either clarifying an interpretation or setting up a new process or something like that within their own jurisdiction. And they will release a draft language of how they plan to do that. They'll gather public comment on it from stakeholders, and then they will digest all of that public comment. They'll hear what their staff have to say, and then they will eventually make their decision. Importantly, as a member of the public, your public comment in a rulemaking is part of the record. It is allowed to influence the decision of the commissioners. This is important because in a contested case, which is more like a court case, public comment can be made, but is not part of the official record. So in a contested case, which is, again, similar to the rate review or the rate case that Northwestern went through last year, public comment, there was a lot of public comment, but technically it's not allowed to be part of the official record. And this is really important going forward. Just thinking about kind of how you can influence, the Public Service Commission, right? And how to make your voice heard. So a lot of people will, instead of, as a member of the public, you're not really allowed to engage directly with commissioners on this issue, or at least you are, but your comments are not part of the official record. You will typically get involved with an intervener or try to become an intervener. Intervening just means formal involvement. If you do intervene, it's a pretty intense and robust process. You file testimony, you provide evidence and expert witnesses. Any witnesses that you provide are subject to cross-examination. Any testimony you submit is subject to what's called discovery, which means the other interveners can ask you questions about your testimony. And then, of course, you have to attend the formal hearings. And this is typically why it's hard to do all of this. You typically lawyer up, you typically hire a lawyer in order to navigate this process and help you through it, which is, it's more challenging for the public to be part of contested case proceedings than it is rulemakings. That's why a lot of advocacy groups are out there who get involved in regulatory dockets in order to make sure that their constituents and their members have that voice. Now, one thing I want to mention that's really important, especially with this kind of public comment, public engagement issue, is this concept of ex parte communication. So you can think of interveners and commissioners talking kind of about this court case scenario. The commissioners are really the judge. And what ex parte communication is it would be like the defendant or the prosecutor trying to talk to the judge in the middle of a case, right? That obviously is going to skew things. All those conversations are supposed to be part of the record. And if you go outside of that, then you're considered going outside the legal process, and it's unfair to the other interveners. So you're not supposed to have communication like that. Now, importantly, it goes both ways. Interveners aren't supposed to engage commissioners in that way. And similarly, commissioners are not supposed to engage interveners in that way. So you have to be very careful when you're intervening. The other thing that I'll mention, which is a little different than ex parte communication, but as an intervener, somebody involved in this formal kind of legal proceeding, advocacy groups, although their membership may want them to be involved in a docket, they have restrictions on what they can and cannot share based on certain details that are being discussed in the docket. And this is important because I know it came up for MREA, for example, when we were working on the net metering issue and the rate case. We wanted to provide updates to our members and to the public, but there were certain things we weren't allowed to do, and there are certain things we were allowed to do. And there's some real nuance to that I'm not going to get into, but I think it's just important for folks to understand that it's not that advocacy groups necessarily want to hide information or keep their members out of the loop. It's that we're legally restricted from doing certain things, which can make things challenging. In terms of public involvement, another way to get involved is to contact the Montana Consumer Council. This is another state government office that is in fact so important that the position is enshrined in our state constitution. And their role is to really represent the public interest at the legislature and at the Public Service Commission, sometimes even at FERC at the federal level and things like that. So they have a lead counsel, they have some support staff as well. I will mention there's currently no real robust process for gaining public input. It's not like the PSC where you can go to a contact page and easily submit comments on an issue. They can be contacted. Obviously, their contact information is on the Office of the Consumer Council website, which is a legislative branch website. So they can be contacted, but they are definitely an important entity in terms of engaging with the legislature and the public. So I want to close here with just a couple updates about renewable energy kind of goings-ons in the world. First of all, I talked a lot about net metering and the rate review that happened last year. This was obviously a huge win for renewable energy advocates. MREA was the lead organization with our national partners working on the net metering issue, and we were incredibly thrilled at the victory that we got with the PSC. Unfortunately, this was just last Thanksgiving. Unfortunately, just a few months later, this past April, a group in New England filed a petition with FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that would have significantly undermined net metering on a national scale. So we were obviously concerned with the Montana issue. This was even a larger effort. And in short, what happened was FERC, again, rejected this petition. And we have more information about this on our website at montanarenewables.org/FERC/FERC. You can read more about what the petition was and what its implications would have been. But in short, it was rejected, which was great. The comments supporting the petition totaled about 22, and the comments opposing totaled more than 57,000. Essentially, that group was trying to move net metering into federal jurisdiction and change the way net metering customers would have been compensated, and clearly there was an outcry against it. I will mention from Montana in particular, I know there were several hundred Montanans who raised their voice to oppose the petition, including our Attorney General, Tim Fox, co-signed a letter with other Attorney Generals opposing it, and our Montana Energy Office also submitted comments opposing it. So we are greatly appreciative of the folks who made public comment on this issue and made sure net metering is safe going into the future. The other issue I want to talk about is PURPA and QFs. We obviously talked about this and its important role with Montana. There are some lawsuits pending. Back in 2016. Our PSC changed the contract terms for QFs, that standard offer that I mentioned. And there were some lawsuits afterwards because certain advocacy groups and developers felt that those changes were inconsistent with PURPA and violated PURPA. So that has been multiple years in the works. It has officially run through all of the process, but it is now waiting for a Supreme Court decision, which will be the final decision on what to do with the QFs affected by that decision. But meanwhile, as I mentioned, the PSC regularly reviews and updates these terms. So even though the terms and rates from this 2016 ruling are under review and under contest, the PSC is actually working through approving new rates and contract terms right now. I believe they had the hearing just in the past few months, and so that process is still moving forward. Despite that, there are QFs still being developed around the state. I know there are a couple 80 megawatt and larger projects. There's some solar plus storage. There's some wind plus storage projects. And these are happening all over the state. In the eastern part of the state, I know there's some down by Dillon, a number of them. And really the reason I bring this up is because it's a good sign. You know, despite the challenges that we're seeing with these QF rates and what's going to happen with them, it's exciting to see that developers are coming to Montana and want to take advantage of our solar and wind resource. The other thing I'll bring up here is just this FERC and PURPA decision. At the same time that FERC saved net metering, it made some changes to PURPA that may actually negatively affect QF development. And what they did was they changed the fixed price rules. So as I mentioned, these QF get fixed prices for their contract, for the length of their contract. And it's important, what FERC did was they opened up the option to make those prices varying through the length of the contract, which would really make it challenging for developers to finance those projects and help them come to fruition. The FERC decision is important because it allows our commission to consider adopting those changes. And again, these varying rates could make it really challenging for development. So I know that advocates are already mobilizing to oppose this decision, to try and reverse it. It'd obviously be bad for renewable energy development. So we don't know if that'll filter down to Montana, but it's something that advocacy groups are keeping an eye on. I'll do a quick plug here. That's the end of the meat of the presentation. There's a lot more detail that I wasn't able to get into today. All that information and all those details are on our website at montanarenewables.org/PSC. And if you want to learn about our actual work and activity, you can go to montanarenewables.org/policy, which is our policy and advocacy blog, which has some more updates and current events on what we've been working on, including the dockets we're working on, the policies that we're working on, and things like that. So I encourage you to do so. And then the last plug I will give, MREA does not and cannot endorse candidates for public office, but we certainly can encourage people to vote, and I would encourage you to vote in the PSC election. It is unfortunately overlooked by far too many people, and it's really, really important. So districts 2, 3, and 4 are all up for election this year, and I hope you will participate. We're at the top of the hour. I understand some folks might need to jump off, but I will stay on for a little bit and answer some questions. So again, you can use the chat box to submit questions if you would like, and I will try to get through a couple of them. So give me a minute. I'll read some of these questions and see if we can start diving in. Let's see, this first question is about regulation of internet. It's a great question. You know, it's a little out of the wheelhouse of MREA, essentially talking about kind of rural access to internet and what would be required for the Public Service Commission to start regulating internet. Yeah, I think that's kind of out of our wheelhouse. I haven't looked into internet providers, and so I don't think I'd be able to knowledgeably answer that question. But to the person who submitted that question, if you want to talk more about it, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be interested to hear more about your perspective. Let's see. Another question about, let's see, railroad systems. Yeah, again, not quite within our wheelhouse at MREA, focusing more on energy and kind of electricity within the jurisdiction of the PSC. But again, if you want to talk more about that, definitely shoot me an email and I'd be happy to. The PSC is certainly engaged in other issues outside of energy, right? Telecommunications, water, transportation. But for today's efforts, we're gonna focus on the energy side of things. Let's see. What was the link for the PSC a few slides back? Well, that's an easy one. I'll just go right there. MontanaRenewables.org/PSC. That'll take you to the detailed info about the PSC. I should also mention too, we just ordered another updated version of our PSC booklets. So all of the information that you'll find on that webpage, we have in a short, it's about 20-page booklet that kind of walks through it all. So if you want a physical copy to either have yourself or to share with colleagues or friends, please definitely reach out to MREA. I would be happy to send you a number of them. Are the slides available for download? I don't have them available for download, but we will be having a recording available. If you're interested in getting a copy of the slides, definitely shoot me an email and I can get you probably a PDF copy of them pretty easily. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions coming in, but I just want to thank you all for joining us. I encourage you to join us next week. We're going to be jumping into our next few presentations. We'll talk about how renewable energy impacts and overlaps with certain industries. And next week, we're talking about electric vehicles and transportation. So I hope you will join us, but thank you again for tuning in and have a great rest of your Thursday.